Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Another video here from Mr. Anselmi. I'm going to be talking about the Middle Ages today, and we're going to dive right in because we have a lot to cover. We're going to talk about how Rome and its fall is really what leads to castles, knights, and lords of the Middle Ages, the medieval period, or the Dark Ages, as you might have been taught them. Right? And we're going to talk about why the Middle Ages weren't the Dark Ages. Here we have a painting by Thomas Cole in 1831 called Destruction. It is a depiction of a city being sacked, and that's where our story starts today with the sack of Rome in 476. Now, Rome fell to barbarian invasion in 476, and I want you to understand, right? Europe at the time was a lot like this bottle, right? It's got water and oil. I know it's green, but it's water. I wanted it to show up on camera, right? When left alone, water and oil create a stable line. But when Rome falls, right, it's like the whole thing gets shaken up and slammed on the table. And now all of a sudden it has to resettle. We're going to talk about how and why that happened. Rome was the stabilizing factor, the backbone of Europe, right? From the mid 5th century BC or BCE to the mid 5th century AD or CE, right? And that means that they were the stability. And when the stability is gone, people have mostly three reactions. Now, at our school, we do intruder drills about once a year. And unfortunately, they're just a part of life now. What they teach us at our school, there's three reactions to if there's an intruder in your school. Depending on your circumstances, you should either run, hide, or fight. And what I found when I was preparing a lecture on the Middle Ages is that that's actually pretty natural human reactions to large events in history. People either run, they hide, or they fight. Let's start with the last two, hide and fight. See, people, when Rome falls, there's a lot of people who will stay in the cities and they'll serve their new overlords or their old overlords or whomever they think will leave them alone, right? A lot of times people do what they do to be left alone. I think as high school students, some of you can relate to that. And then there's people who have a different opinion, and I call them the fight. Those that fight, you see, they see an opportunity where other people see something to fear. They see the fall of Rome as a chance. Rome was a power structure, and when it falls, there's a vacuum. Those that fight, usually they're already well positioned, but those that fight use those moments as an opportunity to further themselves or their cause. And in this story, most of those people will serve the group who run. Now, where are they running to? A lot of people flee the cities and they run to the country. You see, in the country, they knew they would find big houses. They would find villas. If you were wealthy enough in Rome, you didn't have a house, you had a villa. And a villa was a kind of a self-contained situation, right? These people didn't need much from anyone that they couldn't provide for themselves. They've got an orchard, right here, and they've got livestock, and they've got cranes, and they've got parade grounds. They've got everything they need in their villa. You see, because when I was a kid, it never really made sense to me when I was taught about Europe, when I was taught history, and you've got Rome, and then all of a sudden you've got castles and kings and lords and knights, and it never made sense. But now it does. You see, the villa system is the piece that keeps this all together. When people are fleeing, they're going to come across villas. And the owners of those villas, if they're shrewd enough, they're going to open their doors and say, sure, yeah, come on in, right? You can stay here. You can work on our land. I'll provide you and your family protection. And you can work on my land and keep some of the food for yourself. Pass the rest along to me. It's really not a bad deal, right? In uncertain times, these people provided stability. Now, this is going to lead to the development of the medieval manor. Right? Those villas are going to grow beyond just a home and some acreage. They're going to grow to where thousands of people live, right? A manor in this time, look here, they've got common pasture grounds. They've got the place where they put the autumn planting, the place where they plant for the spring, right? They've got their own pond, their own wells, their own river, their own forests. And this is why in movies and things, if someone gets caught, they say, no, that's the king's deer that you've killed. This is the king's forest. It's kind of true. This was his land, right? These manors are growing, and they're going to grow into kingdoms, right? Now, if you think back to that bottle that I showed you at the beginning, right? When it's flipped over, as it settles, bubbles form. And those bubbles will get bigger, and they'll take over other bubbles, right? Slowly making their way back to stability, to calm. And that's what's going on in Europe. This is a map of Europe from 1190, almost 400 years after the fall of Rome, right? And if you see it, it kind of looks like so many bubbles. This doesn't look like Europe if you've seen a map of Europe recently. This is broken, right? You've got lines everywhere. Germany right in the middle of the Holy Roman Empire. France has divisions, right? Spain has divisions, and so on and so forth. Europe will have these kingdoms as these bubbles grow, expand, take over one another, and fall, right? So they come from the manorial system, right? That's the economic side of things. The other word you might have heard is feudalism. Now, manorialism and feudalism are two sides of the same coin. Manorialism is the economic system, the way in which, right, you get people to produce things, and then those things move on to a lord, and that lord will send some of that food on to the king, or some of those goods onto the king, and that's going to be what drives the economics. The social structure, the political structure, is feudalism, okay? And it looks like this. You've probably seen this. Now, at the heart of feudalism is a concept known as fealty. Fealty is the swearing of loyalty, right? And it's spelled right. Fealty, okay? Fealty is the swearing of loyalty, and you see this in movies, right? The knights swearing their loyalty to the king, but that loyalty was really important. It's the formalization of the agreement that we just talked about, right? I swear to give you what I have in exchange for what you can provide, right? The king will provide protection. The king will provide food. He will provide housing. He will provide whatever it is. And you will provide whatever you can, right? Be it the food that you grow or the leather that you work on or your services as a knight. And that's how you get to this structure, right? You've got, right, all these serfs and peasants, right, swearing their fealty, usually to barons or lords, who in turn swear their fealty to the king, right? Now, here's the thing, though. This still leaves a lot of bubbles in our oil and our water. Europe is still ununified, except that it's not. There is unification in Europe. It's just not political unification. The central unifying power of Europe during the Middle Ages is the Catholic Church. You see, at the fall of Rome, Europe is Catholic. And it will continue to be so. In fact, even though all those kingdoms, many of them are warring with each other or fighting with each other, during the Middle Ages, the Pope is the only person who can crown a king. They all agree, right, that the king, he swears his fealty to God. He's no different than the peasant, right, in their terms, because he also swears fealty, okay? That God is the Christian God, right? And the Christian church is the unifying glue of Europe in the Middle Ages. You see, the stability no longer comes from political rulers. The stability, the day-to-day stability, often comes from the Catholic Church. People get their mass regularly where they can or when they can. The Catholic Church provides education, not for all, but for who they can, right? Typically nobles, sons, right? They are the preservers and keepers of knowledge. We're going to get to that one in a second, right? They provide hospital care, home care, and a lot of services. That's stabilizing, right? Let's talk about that keeper of knowledge term that I just said. You see, there are two groups that really deserve a lot of credit for as to why the Dark Ages weren't dark at all. These are monks in a medieval scriptorium, and these are Islamic scholars in the Baghdad House of Wisdom, and they're both doing more or less the same thing. They are hand copying texts. Hand copying texts. The monks are copying religious texts, Catholic texts, philosophical texts, ancient classical texts, and they're keeping them in Greek and in Latin, right? Universal languages that most of Europe knows or is familiar with. The Islamic scholars are hand copying Islamic texts, religious texts, philosophical texts, classical texts, and they're doing it in Arabic, a language that most of the Middle East speaks at the time. You see, these two groups, along with others, but these two primarily, preserve knowledge, kind of keep it safe, right, during a very difficult time when the world is politically unstable. They will keep that knowledge until it gets released again in the Renaissance, and we'll get there in a second. Let's talk about how and why feudalism ends, because it is an incredibly stable structure. Yeah, if you're a serf, you might live your whole life on your farm and never really make it past your own manor or your own city's castle, right? But it was a stable life. And if you had a good king, which, believe me, there were good kings, your life wasn't so bad. Now, it could be horrible, it could be oppressive, and it oftentimes was. But my point is the political stability offered by feudalism is great. So what brings it to an end? Well, it's ironic that at the time of this filming, I'm filming in the year 2020, right in the middle of COVID, and it feels like our whole world has been turned upside down. But what I try to tell my students is we've been through worse before, and we've returned to normal. Europe gets hit with the Black Death, the bubonic plague. Now, it actually gets hit with several plagues over time, but when we talk about the Black Death, we're talking about the outbreak in 1348. And this is a painting called Triumph of Death by Peter Bruegel, the Elder, right? And I encourage you to go look it up. I like to use art. I actually think I skipped over one, right? This is the painting is called the Triumph of Christian Religion. There's a lot of triumph today by Tommaso Loretti, and I think it speaks to where the Christian church, right, being the stabilizing factor over the pagan gods of Rome at the time, right? It's just kind of perspective. But here, right, Bruegel is showing the brutal effect that the plague has on Europe. 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe dies. As a result, feudalism and neoliberalism are unsustainable. They're unsustainable. And people do one of three things when the Black Death hits. They run, they hide, or they fight. Right? Many of them run to where they can get work, which is cities. You see a huge influx in city populations. Many of them hide. They stay where they are and they try to ignore the plague and they just try to live. Right? And who could blame them? And many will see the bubonic plague as an opportunity for growth. Right? Like these power structures that are left vacant will spend the 13 and the 1400s building themselves up. One example is the Medici family, who in the 1400s revolutionized banking and brings a huge amount of money to Florence. Well, on top of that, in 1453, Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Empire, which brings a huge influx of Byzantine scholars to Venice and Florence. And on top of that, you've got huge population increases from what I just said, right? The bubonic plague and then on from the mid-1300s, mid-1400s. And now you've got a kind of a perfect storm of money, talent, and manpower. And that's where you get the Renaissance. Renaissance really begins mid-1400s arguably a little sooner, but in Florence. And you get paintings like this, The School of Athens by Raphael, right? It's important to see that something like this wouldn't have been possible if the Dark Ages were actually dark. If those monks, those Islamic scholars, hadn't kept the knowledge, right, until there was a time that we could use it, it would have been lost. And the Dark Ages really would have been dark. So, hope you learned how and where those castles and those knights came from and why they were so important. I hope you and your family are safe. Thanks, and keep perspective.